You take a sip of something cold. Your shoulders drop. The room feels a little warmer, a little friendlier. You've done this 1,000 times without thinking about it. But what if this exact feeling is older than your species? Older than language, older than fire, older than the human brain itself. For most of human history, getting drunk wasn't a weekend mistake. It wasn't a vice tacked onto civilization after the fact. It was one of the tools that built civilization in the first place. Not a side effect of being human, a cause of it. This isn't a story about indulgence. It's a story about chemistry, trust, and survival. And it starts 10 million years before the first human ever stood upright. 10 million years ago, your ancestors lived in trees. Life up there was simple. Fruit grew within arm's reach, ripe and sealed. But the climate was shifting. Forests were thinning. Food sources were changing. And slowly, some of your ancestors began spending more time on the ground. Down there, the fruit was different. It had already fallen. It had already split open. And it had already started to rot. Rotting fruit does something specific. Wild yeast colonizes the sugars and converts them into ethanol. Alcohol, in other words. For a tree-dwelling primate, this would have been mostly irrelevant. But for a ground-dwelling one, eating fallen fruit was no longer optional. It was dinner. Here's where it gets strange. Around this exact period, scientists identified a single genetic mutation that gave this ground-dwelling ancestor a dramatically improved ability to break down ethanol. Not a little better, roughly 40 times more efficient. This wasn't an accident of taste. It was an adaptation for survival. Think about what that means. Long before tools, long before fire, long before anything resembling a human brain, your lineage was already evolving the biological machinery to process alcohol. Not because anyone wanted to get drunk, because the alternative was starving. So, the next time someone says alcohol tolerance is a modern problem, remember this. Your body was built to handle it before it was built to handle almost anything else. Fast forward roughly 9,900,000 years. Humans now stand upright. They speak. They bury their dead. And in a cave above the Mediterranean coast, in what is now northern Israel, something remarkable happens. The site is called Rakafet Cave. It's a burial ground roughly 13,000 years old, holding around 30 graves. In 2018, archaeologists studying stone mortars from the site found residue and wear patterns consistent with one specific activity: brewing beer. Not drinking beer, brewing it on site as part of a funeral. This predates farming in the region by close to 2,000 years. Think about the order of operations here. We tend to assume agriculture came first, and that beer was simply something farmers eventually figured out how to make with their surplus grain. Rakafet suggests something closer to the opposite. Hunter-gatherers with no fields, no permanent homes, and no domesticated crops were already going out of their way to ferment grain into alcohol, and they were doing it specifically to honor people who had died. Before beer was a beverage, it was an offering, a way of saying goodbye to someone in a ritual designed to be shared by everyone left behind. So, what does this tell you about why alcohol exists in human culture at all? It tells you that, from the very beginning, alcohol wasn't really about the drink. It was about the moment around the drink. That idea gets even stranger about 1,000 years later, and about 200 miles north, at a site called Göbekli Tepe. If you haven't heard of it, here's the short version. Göbekli Tepe is widely considered the oldest known monumental structure on Earth. massive carved stone pillars arranged in circles built roughly 11,500 years ago. The catch: the people who built it were hunter-gatherers. No agriculture, no writing system, no permanent city, no state, no king, no bureaucracy to organize the labor. So how did a society with none of the usual tools of civilization manage to quarry, carve, and erect multi-ton stone pillars? Archaeologists studying massive stone troughs at the site, some large enough to hold more than 150 liters, found chemical residue consistent with fermenting cereal grain. In plain terms, industrial-scale beer production at the site of the oldest temple ever built by people who technically didn't even have farms yet. The leading interpretation is straightforward. Beer wasn't a reward handed out after the work was done. Beer was part of what made the work possible at all. Large group gatherings, large feasts, and yes, large quantities of beer may have been the social glue that pulled scattered hunter-gatherer bands together long enough to build something none of them could have built alone. You don't need writing to organize a civilization. Apparently, you just need a really good party. Why would alcohol have this effect biologically speaking? Why would something that impairs your coordination and judgment also be the thing that builds trust between strangers? The Oxford researcher Robin Dunbar has spent years studying the behaviors that bond human groups together. Laughing, singing, dancing, storytelling around a fire. All of these activities, it turns out, trigger the release of endorphins, the same brain chemicals involved in pain relief and pleasure, and the same chemicals responsible for that warm, connected feeling you get in a group of people you trust. Dunbar's research found that alcohol triggers this exact same endorphin system. Functionally, getting a group of people drunk together produces the same neurological signature as singing together, or dancing together, or laughing together for an hour straight. In other words, alcohol isn't a shortcut around social bonding. It's literally using the same machinery social bonding already uses. A round of drinks with friends isn't a poor substitute for connection. To your brain, it's a legitimate form of it. This is also probably why drinking alone has never carried the same cultural weight as drinking together. The chemistry was never really about the alcohol. It was about what the alcohol allowed people to do collectively. Now picture what ancient beer actually was. Not a crisp, clear pint poured from a tap. Something closer to a thick, cloudy, almost edible soup packed with leftover grain and yeast. This matters more than it sounds like it should. The fermentation process that produces alcohol also produces lysine, an amino acid essential for building protein in the body, along with a wide range of B vitamins critical to immune and nervous system function. Ancient beer wasn't just a drink. In calorie-scarce environments, it was closer to a meal. And there's a second, even more practical benefit. Brewing beer requires boiling water. Boiling water kills the bacteria and pathogens that made untreated water sources dangerous to drink in many ancient settlements. One historian summarized it simply: the boiling and the natural acidity that came with fermentation functioned as inadvertent water purification. So, in places where clean drinking water wasn't guaranteed, beer wasn't a luxury indulgence competing with water. In a very real sense, it was often the safer option. This single fact explains why beer became so deeply woven into daily survival across the ancient world, not as an occasional treat, but as a dietary staple consumed by entire populations, including children, on a near-daily basis. Now take that staple, multiply it by an entire workforce, and you start to understand how some of the most famous structures in human history actually got built. A cuneiform tablet dating back to roughly 3000 BC, discovered in the Mesopotamian city of Uruk, documents something specific: laborers being paid not in coin, but in rations of beer. This wasn't unique to Mesopotamia. In ancient Egypt, the workers who quarried, hauled, and stacked the stone blocks of the pyramids received daily beer rations as a core part of their compensation. Archaeologist Patrick McGovern, who has spent decades studying ancient fermented beverages, put the scale of this bluntly: each worker received an estimated 4 to 5 liters of beer a day. His conclusion was equally blunt. Without it, there would have been a rebellion. The pyramids, quite possibly, would not exist in their current form without a steady, guaranteed beer supply. Picture that for a moment. Some of the most awe-inspiring architecture ever constructed by human hands exists, at least in part, because the labor force was reliably and abundantly supplied with beer, not as an afterthought, as payroll. But beer wasn't only solving problems within a community. It may have helped solve one of the hardest problems between strangers. Most primates are deeply cautious around individuals outside their immediate group. Trusting someone you're not related to, someone who could just as easily be a threat as an ally, is not the natural default. So how did early humans manage to form alliances, trade networks, and eventually entire civilizations built on cooperation between unrelated strangers? The philosopher Edward Slingerland has argued that alcohol played a specific functional role here. As he puts it, sitting down to share a few drinks with someone is a form of voluntary cognitive disarmament. Alcohol reduces the brain's capacity for tight self-control and suspicion. Sharing a drink with a stranger was in effect a way of signaling, "I am lowering my guard around you. I trust you enough to do this." Before written contracts, before courts, before any formal system of law existed to enforce agreements between strangers, sharing alcohol may have been one of the only available ways for two people with no blood relation to credibly signal that they weren't a threat to one another. This idea isn't just philosophical speculation either. A study published in 2025, analyzing 186 non-industrial societies around the world, found a measurable positive relationship between the presence of traditional fermented beverages and the political complexity of a society. The more elaborate a culture's drinking traditions, the more complex its political structures tended to be across continents, across unrelated cultures, independently arriving at the same pattern. The study also found that alcohol served different functions depending on social position.